You think you would have stopped. Almost everyone does. In 1961, Stanley Milgram tested that assumption on hundreds of ordinary people, and what he found is the most uncomfortable fact ever produced by a psychology lab. Milgram wasn't studying cruelty. He was studying something quieter and far more dangerous. He was studying why ordinary people follow orders. The question had been sitting in the middle of the 20th century like something nobody wanted to look at directly. The Nuremberg trials had just finished. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, had recently been captured in Argentina and put on trial in Jerusalem. His defense was simple. He was following orders. He was doing his job. He was, by every account, a perfectly ordinary man. The philosopher Hannah Arendt sat through that trial and came away with a phrase that would follow her for the rest of her life. She called it the banality of evil. Not monsters, ordinary people. Milgram wanted to know how ordinary. He set up a laboratory at Yale University and placed an advertisement in a local newspaper. He was looking for volunteers for a study on memory and learning. He paid them $4 for their time, which in 1961 was enough to cover a decent lunch. They arrived one by one, middle-aged men mostly, postal workers, teachers, engineers, salesmen, a cross-section of New Haven, Connecticut, walking in off the street. Each volunteer was told they would be playing the role of a teacher. Another participant, seated in a separate room and strapped to a chair, would be the learner. The teacher would read out pairs of words. If the learner got one wrong, the teacher would administer an electric shock. For every wrong answer, the voltage would increase. The shock generator in front of the teacher had 30 switches. They started at 15 volts and climbed in 15-volt increments all the way to 450 volts. The higher switches were labeled clearly. 375 volts, danger, severe shock. 435 volts and 450 volts carried a single label, XXX. What the volunteers didn't know was that the learner wasn't a volunteer at all. He was an actor. The shocks weren't real. The screams coming through the wall were a recording. The whole thing was staged. The only real variable in the room was the teacher. The only real question was how far they would go. At 75 volts, the learner grunted. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were painful. At 150 volts, he demanded to be let out. At 180 volts, he screamed that he couldn't stand the pain. At 300 volts, he pounded on the wall and stopped answering questions entirely. After 330 volts, there was only silence. The teachers knew that silence. They could feel what it meant. Many of them trembled. Some laughed, not because it was funny, but because their nervous system had nowhere else to put what was happening. They looked at the experimenter in the gray lab coat standing beside them and asked if they should stop. The experimenter said 4 things, and only 4 things, in a flat, neutral voice. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. That was it. No threats, no punishment, no authority beyond a lab coat and a calm tone of voice. 65% of participants administered the full 450-volt shock. Not a fringe group, not people who scored high on cruelty tests beforehand. 2/3 of a random sample of ordinary people from a mid-sized American city went all the way to the switch marked XXX, on the other side of a wall where a man had stopped answering and might, for all they knew, be dead. Milgram ran the experiment again and again. He changed the variables one at a time, systematically, the way you dismantle a machine to find out which part was doing the work. When he moved the experiment out of Yale and into a run-down commercial building in Bridgeport with no university affiliation, obedience dropped, but only to 47.5%, still nearly half. When he put the learner in the same room as the teacher, obedience dropped further. When the teacher had to physically press the learner's hand onto a shock plate, it dropped further still. But it never went to 0. Even when the man was right there in the room, 30% of people kept going. Then Milgram ran the experiment with women. The assumption at the time, spoken or not, was that women would be more empathetic, more resistant, more likely to stop. The obedience rate among women was 65%, identical to the men.
Not a single percentage point of difference. Whatever was happening in that room, it wasn't about gender. It was about something structural that cut straight through both. He tried another variation. He removed the experimenter from the room entirely, delivering instructions by telephone from a separate location. Obedience dropped sharply to 20.5%. Many participants quietly administered lower shocks than instructed and lied about it when asked. The authority was the same person, with the same credentials, giving the same instructions. The only thing that changed was physical presence. Proximity to power, it turned out, was doing more work than the power itself. Then Milgram tried something else. He put 2 actors in the room as additional teachers. When those actors refused to continue at a certain voltage and walked away from the experiment, obedience collapsed. 90% of real participants stopped. One person with the courage to say no was enough to break the spell entirely. That last finding is the one that gets buried. Everyone remembers the 65%. Almost nobody remembers that a single dissenting voice in the room reduced it to 10%. Milgram's conclusion was not that humans are secretly evil. That was the reading people reached for because it was easier. His actual conclusion was about structure. He argued that when a person enters a system with a defined hierarchy, a clear authority, and a stated purpose, something shifts inside them. They stop seeing themselves as a moral agent making individual choices. They start seeing themselves as a component, someone whose job is to carry out instructions, not to evaluate them. He called this the agentic state. You don't stop being a person, you stop acting like one. And this is where Hannah Arendt's phrase lands with its full weight. She wasn't describing Eichmann as an excuse. She was describing him as a warning. The banality of evil doesn't mean evil is small. It means evil doesn't always need malice to function. It just needs a system, a role, and someone willing to keep doing their job. The experiment has been partially replicated as recently as 2009 by psychologist Jerry Berger at Santa Clara University, who ran participants up to 150 volts, the point at which the learner first demands to be released, and found obedience rates nearly identical to Milgram's original numbers. Nothing had changed, not in 50 years. Not in a different decade, a different generation, a different cultural moment. The same result, sitting there in the data, unchanged. This isn't a story about 1961. Every system you have ever been a part of, a workplace, a school, a military, a bureaucracy, a family with a strict hierarchy, creates the conditions Milgram built in that room. A defined role, a stated purpose, and authority that tells you what good performance looks like. Most of the time, that structure produces nothing more sinister than meetings that run too long and forms that get filed. But the structure doesn't know what it's being used for. It just runs. And the people inside it run with it. The question Milgram was really asking wasn't whether people are good or evil. It was whether goodness survives the presence of a system that makes evil feel like procedure. And the answer, across hundreds of participants and dozens of variations, was not often enough. You think you would have stopped. Before you walked into that room, so did 65% of the people who didn't.